Most women going through perimenopause have been spending years trying to just eat less, just do more cardio, push through exhaustion, and their body still isn't responding. And somewhere in your late 30s or 40s, the same diet and workouts don't work anymore. You're more bloated, you have more cravings, less energy, you're getting worse sleep, and you're getting less results for the same, if not more effort. And that's not just in your head. So today, we are going to be breaking down what perimenopause actually does to your hormones and metabolism, connecting the symptoms to real life experiences, and why the old strategies may actually now be making things worse.
I wanna heal, I wanna feel like I'm close to something real, somewhere I belong.
First, as always, if you're new to the show, I'm Gavin Scribolito, a functional health coach helping women to stop fighting their bodies and start finally understanding them. And my mission is to make health, nutrition, training, and mindset seem simple and doable. I've helped over 200 women transform using our root method, addressing the root causes of underlying issues so their body can finally respond and heal. Now, let's get into today's topic, which is how we can get you to start thriving in menopause. And this is going to be a 3-part series actually, but this whole first video here, I want you to understand a little bit more of the nuances, a little bit of the science, and understand the shift that's actually going on, because I can guarantee you someone likely never explained this to you. I think a lot of women get extremely dismissed when they go to doctors or even some coaches in the industry, and they explain that they are doing everything they can, they're working out, they're staying on top of their diet, maybe even again being so stringent that you're tracking your macros and everything, and you're working out, you're putting so much effort in, and you're told like it's just your age, or you're just not in a calorie deficit, or you just need to lose weight. Like, it's all extremely dismissive, and I think that your symptoms of this really get put into silos, and they're all treated individually, when in reality this is all one big shift. It's all happening at once, and there's a lot of connections that I want to make for you here today so you can understand that shift a little bit better, so you can actually be able to understand what's really going on and know how to actually be able to attack this. There's a lot of things that we can start to see arise during this transition in your life, and these are not things that you're just crazy for. Like, this is real life experiences, not even just from some science around it, which is unfortunately extremely limited, but also in real life practical anecdotal evidence I've even seen from coaching many women through perimenopause and menopause. Now, like I had mentioned, what used to work can typically start to backfire now, because we have to understand that we're on a new playing field. Okay, this is a different ball game now, right? This isn't the same football game. Like, we're in rugby now, so we understand that there is a lot of some different situations that are at play, and we have to change the game. Okay, so I want to kind of dive into a little bit more of explaining the hormonal shifts for you, of what is actually going on, so you can start to understand and create a clear picture of this isn't just your body's broken, okay, your metabolism is broken, or you have a slow metabolism, right? Like, there's a lot of these words and phrases being thrown around, and I think that it's really missing the forest for the trees, right? Now, the biggest shift that we're going to see here is obviously going to be your estrogen. Okay, estrogen is pretty much your main ovarian hormone on top of progesterone, but estrogen is going to start to wildly fluctuate in perimenopause before it just completely drops off at the end of menopause. Okay, and what we can see from this is a number of things. One of them is going to be actually a shift in fat distribution. So a lot of women will start to say, like, they feel like they're just getting a lot of belly fat, and they can't get rid of it there. This actually can be due to the hormonal shift in estrogen, because we can actually typically see shifts in weight distribution from hips or thighs to your abdomen, and it's actually due to the shift between subcutaneous fat and actually visceral fat, which visceral fat is a little bit more around surrounding your organs, as opposed to subcutaneous would be on the outside of muscle tissue and stuff like that. So that can start to shift a little bit from that hormonal disruption there. But what we can also see is a cascade of events start to rise from this. We can see your insulin sensitivity begins to drop, which does lead to a rise in insulin resistance. And this is largely due to the estrogen shift, because estrogen plays a role in regulating blood glucose. So when we start to have your estrogen regulating blood glucose drop, now we have more dysregulated patterns. Okay, now this doesn't happen for everybody. There is quite a lot of women that, if you have really good dietary practices, there's ways to manage this with diet, lifestyle, exercise, stress management. But this is still a very high likely cause. Like, great example, I have diabetes that runs in my family. I naturally have higher blood glucose. My fasting glucose sits closer to the mid 90s. So I'm kind of borderline. Like, if I let that slip, it could really slide. So for me, I have that kind of working against me. So I have to be really on top of, what I do to help manage that. Whereas the average person that maybe doesn't have diabetes running in their family or doesn't have that predisposition might not have to, worry about it as much. So we have to understand that, even though, you might not be experiencing that entirely, I can tell you from experience, I've had quite a lot of lab work come back from a lot of women in perimenopause, and a good amount of them, we do see insulin resistance start to rise. There's a lot of other variables that can play into that, but what this can do is, since insulin is a storage hormone, now I think insulin gets demonized a lot. It's not a bad thing. Insulin is also what helps you to maintain and build muscle, right? But when your body's resistant to insulin, it means that you have higher levels of blood glucose floating around your bloodstream, which can lead to your body needing to repackage those in your liver as triglycerides, which gets stored as body fat. And this whole cascade gets really, misconstrued, I feel like, because, there's a lot of research that does support that even with insulin resistance present, you cannot gain body fat unless you are in a caloric surplus, right? But we also have to understand that there are also mechanisms at play that are reducing your daily energy expenditure, aka slowing your metabolism. Okay, so insulin sensitivity is one of those things that can start to impair it. And in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism from 2026, a study actually did find that higher fasting insulin in early perimenopause actually led to predicted earlier onset, longer duration, and higher severity of hot flashes. So we not only have it, possibly playing a role in hindering fat loss and fat burning, but we also have it playing a role on increasing the severity of your symptoms. This can also start to lead to more fatigue, a little bit more exhaustion. That can directly also affect your ability to be able to actually exert enough energy. So we have to understand that, there's a side of things that, yes, hormone, that insulin side of things can make fat loss harder. It can start to play a role in inhibiting fat burning in your body, which is known as lipolysis. But we also have it playing a role on other mechanisms that can start to actually lead to reducing energy expenditure further. Okay. Now, what can happen from, another standpoint here is going to be your progesterone. Okay. Obviously, you're not ovulating anymore. As a female, without ovulation, you do not produce estrogen. Okay. Progesterone. So when progesterone drops, this is typically what drops first because, we're not going to be, your body's starting to, have ovarian decline, ovulation. You're going to start to more likely have anovulatory cycles. So progesterone is typically going to be one of those things that can drop first, okay? And this can actually destabilize what is known as your HPA axis, which is your hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. Now stay with me. That is exactly how your brain communicates with your adrenal glands. Your adrenal glands are what produce, hormones like your norepinephrine, epinephrine, which are adrenal. They are, what's the word I'm looking for? Adrenaline, basically, adrenaline-based hormones. They, play a role in your fight or flight. We have cortisol that comes from your adrenal glands, and we also have DHEA. DHEA also is a precursor to testosterone. Okay, that's going to be important in a little bit. But we can see that progesterone, being that it is a calming hormone, can actually lead to lower stress responses, or lower stress tolerance, I should say. So this can actually increase your risk of anxiety, can increase your risk of depression. It can also start to lead to poorer sleep, that decreased stress tolerance as well. So now you're a little bit more irritable. You might even notice that, you kind of have a lot more mood shifts because of this. This is where a lot of that, kind of research around menopause and depression starts to really kind of kick in. Now, I think there's a lot more to that picture. We'll go over that a little bit more in a little bit, but that stress response is going to be huge here. Now, what we can also see is, you have obviously your main adrenal hormone, your main stress hormone, cortisol, which is also your circadian hormone. When we start to have that HPA axis become dysregulated as progesterone falls, not only does stress hit harder, this can obviously also impact poor recovery, but this also being that it is your stress hormone and your circadian hormone, this can also lead to shifts in, your sleep. But there's the research is unfortunately quite limited on this. I will say in practice I see things a lot more from an anecdotal standpoint, but there was a study in Seattle Midlife Women's Health Study where 68% of 22 women total, there was 91 women in the study, but 22 of them were in their mid to late transition of menopause. So in perimenopause, transitioning to late menopause. And they actually did show a significant increase in cortisol when transitioning through that period. But again, there are some other studies that actually did not show that. But we do have documented pretty well in quite a lot of studies is the relationship of progesterone and menopause in general and those hormonal shifts that are happening playing a role on your HPA axis, particularly in other neurotransmitters like GABA, which is another relaxing neurotransmitter, plays a role in relaxation as well, helps with sleep and stuff like that. They're actually GABA supplements, and that can directly start to cause more dysregulation with your HPA axis. So again, we have things that can start to influence cortisol. I think there's a lot more to the picture. I think when someone's life looks like can be very different. I've had quite a lot of blood work come back with perimenopause and menopause women where cortisol wasn't high or low. Can also be low if it's been chronically high for too long. It's considered adrenal insufficiency, where your adrenal glands have been producing cortisol, keeping it elevated to the point where eventually a feedback loop gets into the brain that says, "Hey, this isn't working. Cease production." And then we actually can see low morning cortisol, which can also be a dysregulated pattern that can cause fatigue. But there's a lot of other things that play into this, what is, the individual stress levels, what does their life situations look like, alcohol intake, are they, how intense is their exercise, have they been chronically under eating, there's a lot of things that can influence cortisol and adrenal function. So I think it's more to the picture than just, these hormonal shifts alone, but we do again see that in research that there is a connection between these hormone shifts and it impacting your HPA axis. So again, further, kind of desensitizing, oversensitizing, I guess you could say, your body's, stress response and desensitizing your stress tolerance pretty much. So again, just setting the floor for it being much easier to have stress proliferate. Now, what we can also see that I think oftentimes is so missed in it's a missed or untreated in practice, especially in, Western medical practices with doctors testing hormones and stuff like that, is thyroid. Symptoms overlap significantly with perimenopause because if you do have insulin resistance and if stress is high, we can see that start to actually further impair your thyroid conversion. Okay, because your thyroid, a lot of times doctors will just test TSH, and this is the biggest problem, is TSH is how your brain, similar to how your brain communicates with your adrenal glands, TSH is how your brain communicates with your thyroid. Okay, so it's just a signaling hormone. Essentially, when they just test TSH, they're just testing to make sure that the signal got sent. But the problem is that it doesn't actually tell the picture of what the actual thyroid hormone itself is doing, which we have two. There's T4, which is, think of that as your storage hormone that comes from your thyroid. T4 has to then be converted into T3. T3 is the only form that your cells in your body can actually use. And one of the biggest implications of thyroid hormone is that it acts on your mitochondria, which is like the powerhouse of your cell. If you want to think of how your body makes energy, literally that's where it is, your mitochondria. Okay, T3 directly influences your mitochondria via a lot of enzymatic processes to strengthen your mitochondria. It also helps regulate how your mitochondria use glucose and energy substrates to create ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. It's how your body literally runs on energy. Okay. T3 directly influences that. So if we don't have adequate conversion of T4 to T3, which happens in the liver and a little bit in the gut, that can start to impair your thyroid hormone further. And if we have a lot of these shifts starting to happen, we have, insulin dysregulation, we have possible higher stress levels, high cortisol maybe, that can actually start to impair that conversion and we can see hypothyroidism. But unfortunately, if a doctor only looked at TSH, we have no idea what's actually going on. And I can't tell you how many panels I've seen of lab panels where TSH looks fine. It's in a decent range. But when we finally actually look deeper and get T3 back, it's low. So we need to get T3. That is literally the most important marker. And ideally, free T3 is the best marker to test your free, unbound thyroid hormone that's actually acting on your cells. So we need to look at that to actually see how your thyroid is actually functioning. Now, A really big shift as well, this is the last one here, is your gut health and digestion. Okay, not only can estrogen declining reduce your microbiome diversity, which your microbiome is, think of it like, the world of your gut. Okay, there's all these different species of bacteria. Okay, similar to how there's a lot of different species in the world. Okay, they all act very differently and they all have different roles that they play in its ecosystem. Okay, and when we start to see that microbiome diversity fall or flip, okay, we can notice that there is a less, we have less resiliency in the gut as well here. Okay, so there is a lot of shifts that we can see without getting too deep into like the sciencey stuff of it. Basically, we have shifts in your gut microbiome diversity alone just from estrogen. You actually have this entire mechanism in your gut. It's called the estrobolome, and it actually is specific bacteria strains that play a role in metabolizing estrogen. This is literally its entire role, like, almost to a T of how it manages estrogen. Okay. And it helps with actually recirculating certain estrogens, but also like, recycling and, excreting. And the one big enzymatic activity process of that is known as beta glucuronidase, which helps with reabsorbing certain estrogens in the gut. So that way it can keep your estrogen more balanced. In some cases, with some women, that can actually be overactive, causing estrogen dominance. But obviously it does have a role, and it's one of those things that, we can't demonize it, because it does help balance your hormone levels and your gut. Okay, but since estrogen is declining, that also starts to shift. Your estrobolome starts to change. Okay, it actually becomes reduced. That enzymatic activity becomes reduced, and now we have obviously that pairing with the lower estrogen because it's not helping to recycle it anymore. Okay. That paired with stress, paired with suboptimal thyroid function or hypothyroidism, low progesterone, you're kind of creating this recipe for what is known as gut dysbiosis, which is basically just a fancy way of saying that your gut bacteria is flipping. You have, I call them good bugs and bad bugs, right? We have commensal and opportunistic bacteria. Some obviously have really positive benefits in the gut. Others, they need to be managed, because if they do, start to overgrow, or if other ones that are positive start to undergrow, right, and they get reduced, we can see this flip in your gut microbiome that can lead to a lot more things like food insensitivities. We have higher cravings due to your body actually having worse blood sugar response due to that. We can see a lot of shifts in bloating and just poor digestion upstream, constipation, or loose stool can start to happen. So we can start to see a lot of shifts there, and that's going to directly influence how your gut is actually functioning. This is where a lot of terms like leaky gut comes from, and just gut inflammation as a whole. And if we do have any sort of gut lining permeability, which is basically to say that the cells of your gut lining, which is only one cell thick, mind you, which is not thick at all, if they start to separate, certain pathogens that shouldn't be going out or in can start to pass through, which shouldn't be, and that can lead to higher levels of systemic inflammation. That can cause hormonal imbalance. That can start to cause worse gut symptoms as well. And that's where a lot of doctors actually believe that disease actually stems from. So again, we have a lot of things going on here now. That just is kind of a brief overview of a little bit of some things that are starting to go on, a lot of things that I also see in practice quite often. But now what we need to think of is, what does this actually look like in real life? Okay, so we can actually see this start to impact your body composition. There's actually been a number of studies done, two in particular. We have PMC Sarcopenia Review of 2022 that actually showed a 0.5% drop in lean mass, and a actual 1.7% increase in fat mass during the menopausal transition. Okay, and that's per year. Okay, 0.5% in lean mass drop and a 1.7 increase in fat mass. Right. We also can actually see in another review in 2020 that sarcopenia, which is basically muscle loss, prevalence jumps from 3% up to 30 to 32% by late menopause. Okay, so we have mechanisms that are at play. Now, I think that, again, a lot of nuance with this. If you are not currently resistance training, or if you are in a boat where you're doing a lot of excessive cardio, that's likely a big contributing factor. If you do have, good dietary practices, you're getting good protein intake coming in, you're supporting good recovery, you're prioritizing strength training, I think that can be mitigated quite often. It might be harder to build muscle, because what can start to happen downstream as well is, this is very person to person dependent. A lot of women going through menopause also see a reduction in testosterone, but this is usually mechanistic compared, which is in a relationship to the stress response, right? Hypothetically speaking, your ovaries do produce a good amount of testosterone. And that's why a lot of times we can see also a little bit of a higher strain on the adrenal glands, because we're kind of relying on DHEA from the adrenal glands to actually convert into testosterone now. So we can see a slight reduction in testosterone. But I feel like for most women that I do see, a lot of them usually when they have higher stress, hypothyroid, or they're overtraining, under eating, that can impair your testosterone further. And that can obviously make building muscle or maintaining muscle a little bit more difficult. You can kind of set the environment for you losing muscle a little bit more easily. But for women who are consistently resistance training, focusing on strength training and building muscle, lifting, heavy in relation to obviously safety. We want to make sure we're lifting, safely. That can help prevent sarcopenia. Okay. But there is a lot of research to show that there is a lot of transitions there. And I think a lot of that is mostly likely due to obviously the shifts in energy production, leading to fatigue, leading to not wanting to work out as much, leading to higher cravings and poorer diet or poorer quality diet. There's a lot of things that can be at play with that, right? What I will say again is that a lot of women that come to me who are exercising regularly, who have good overall practices, most of the time they're not noticing muscle loss. They're just noticing a stall in progress. Okay. But again, we want to make sure that those systems are set up to support you being able to maintain muscle at the least. We have belly fat that's not responding to what used to work. Okay. Like I mentioned earlier, that estrogen shift can start to actually lead to a decrease in subcutaneous fat storage and an increase in visceral fat. Okay. That is where a lot of times you'll see more body fat in the midsection. Now, I think what really causes the biggest shift with having a harder time losing that, because visceral fat is actually easier to lose than subcutaneous fat, typically goes first. But the stubborn body fat aspect, I think, comes from a lot of these hormonal shifts, leading to a reduction in your total energy expenditure in the day. Thyroid is going to downregulate. That's going to directly influence energy metabolism. Now your body's burning less energy. If we have low testosterone, that's going to directly influence your mitochondria as well. Also your energy levels, libido, strength, that's going to start to impact things. If that also starts to impair muscle recovery, and we start to notice a little bit of some muscle reduction and losing muscle, that can also now decrease your overall metabolic rate. We have high stress, we have poor gut health and digestive health. These are all things that can start to actually lead to a shift in your total energy expenditure. Okay, things impacting your fatigue. If we have insulin resistance, that can also start to cause more fatigue. We have things that are at play that are starting to lead to your body trying to conserve energy rather than feeling safe to burn energy. Okay, so I think a lot of that is really coming down to the stubbornness of, the approach that you're taking might not be working anymore, especially if you're doing a lot more cardio and stuff like that. You also have fatigue, brain fog, poor recovery, all things that are very, very common. I hear very excessively, especially the brain fog and fatigue side of things. We also have mood shifts. Okay, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but mood shifts. We see a lot of perimenopausal, menopausal women increasing the risk of depression significantly. The Journal of Affective Disorders in 2024 had a meta-analysis of over 9,000 women, and perimenopausal women are 40% more likely to experience depression than premenopausal women. Now, again, as with anything, all research, there is nuance with this. Okay, what that individual woman's lifestyle looks like might be entirely different. One might have a lot higher stress levels than the other, right? It's not like everyone goes through this and everyone gets depression. But we can clearly see in research there's hormonal shifts that can lead to a disruption in neurotransmitters that can start to shift actual hormones and actual chemical messengers in the brain that play a role in your mood, your sense of joy, and your sense of self. Okay, but we also have a lot of things playing a role in how you feel towards yourself, right? You're obviously going through a really big transition. Your confidence is starting to, slip away. You're not feeling yourself anymore. You don't feel as strong. You're starting to feel, like these shifts are, obviously more negative as opposed to positive, so you can start to really see this disruption in how you feel towards yourself, which alone can start to elicit a lot of those depression side effects, but we do have also things shifting from a hormonal perspective that that can start to lead to that, right? Especially if you have poor sleep, right? If you feel really fatigued, like you're gonna start to notice that like that alone can lead to, a sense of depression, right? So I think that there is things on both sides of the equation of, again, what does your lifestyle look like? What do your life choices look like? Do you have other stressors at play here that can also lead to there being impacted on your depression? But hormone side of things and also that lifestyle side of things and like what your life looks like, I think all of those can kind of correlate. We have sleep disruptions. The CDC and NHIS has actually reported that 56% of perimenopausal women get less than 7 hours a night. And a PMC narrative review from 2025 actually noted that sleep disorders affect up to 47% of perimenopausal women and rises up to 60% post-menopause. Okay, so we have a lot of disruptions in sleep. Now again, as with anything, nuances, right? What does your sleep routine look like? I've worked with a lot of women that were getting really bad sleep. Once we started to set better metrics up for a wind down routine, setting some things up like making sure like we have a cool room, some supplementation that can be helpful like magnesium and glycine to help with supporting relaxation, a cooler body temperature to prevent the hot flashes and whatnot. Everyone is going to look very, very different. I have some women that going through perimenopause that don't have a lot of the hot flashes and whatnot, and it's like very mild. Other women have way high hot flashes that really impacts their sleep. Everyone's going to look very, very different, but there are ways to support that. And I will say that a lot of women that I do work with, once we get really good routines in place, their sleep usually starts to become very, very well supported outside of having some moments and some nights where they might notice a little bit more tossing and turning. But compared to when they started working with us versus after, I would even say maybe 4 to 8 weeks, massive differences there. So I do believe that a lot of it can come down to, your routines and how you're setting up your sleep. On top of that, we have obviously increased cravings that can come down to the gut dysbiosis flip that we can see, the increased insulin resistance chance, which obviously can lead to more blood sugar swings. That can lead to higher cravings. We have bloating. We have new food sensitivities due to that shift in your gut. And this can also be driven by a lot of that insulin dysregulation, the stress, the hypothyroid, and again, those gut microbiome shifts that we can start to see. Now, there's a lot of lifestyle factors that can also make this worse, okay? So that's some things that, I've kind of brought up a little bit here. We have chronic dieting and under eating. Prolonged caloric restriction is a physiological stressor, okay? And that can affect thyroid function. It can affect testosterone and cortisol. So that can directly make a lot of this worse. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be trying to be in a calorie deficit, but for a lot of women that come to us and that we've worked with, they have been in a state of trying to diet for years. And that's going to act as another stressor, right? If you are constantly focused on dieting, you're going to have a lot more food noise. You're going to have a much poorer relationship with food. Oftentimes, a lot of women come to us with a fear of eating carbohydrates, and they've been trying to limit their carbohydrates for some time. So chronically under eating or even yo-yo dieting, if you're just falling between cycles of like restricting and binging, that is also still a stressor. This can all start to affect hormone balance, and we need to also support recovery side of things. If you're training a lot on top of that, that can start to obviously worsen recovery, and we can start to see a lot more negative adaptations because of that. You also have excessive cardio. A lot of women come to us doing way too much cardio relative to actual strength training. Okay, this is going to chronically elevate cortisol, and it can be a lot more catabolic, and also your body reduces energy expenditure over time. Okay, whereas with building muscle and strength training, we can actually build muscle, which is going to increase your overall, basal metabolic rate. The more muscle you have, the more metabolically active your body is. It requires more energy by your body, so you can boost your metabolism by building more muscle. And when we're doing cardio, there's no muscle building component. Eventually your body starts to adapt and becomes really good at maintaining and, trying to reduce how much energy you're burning over time. If you ever notice that running becomes easier, it's because your body's adapting. That means it's burning less energy doing the same run. Whereas you might have burnt 500 calories going for a long run before, as you do it more, your body learns how to burn less calories from it. We also have the stress response of it that can start to happen. But I do find that excessive cardio typically is going to hinder a lot of your results. And we can actually see this even in the Journal of Exercise and Nutrition from 2021. Prolonged aerobic exercise, especially at higher intensities, significantly elevated cortisol compared to resistance training of a similar duration. Okay. So there is research to actually support this. I've seen a number of studies as well that have actually shown that even high intensity interval training, at higher frequencies can start to actually lead to metabolic dysfunction like blood glucose dysregulation, fatigue, bloating. There's a lot of things that can start to come from that. And in practice, I see that very, very commonly. Once we start to improve better recovery, better training metrics, we get better results. A lot of women also are avoiding that weight training component. A lot of women think they're going to get bulky. I can promise you it takes a lot to get bulky. Years. And as a woman, again, it is not going to be as easy for you. You physically, your frame will not be able to hold as much muscle unless you are, trying to take, enhancement drugs. But obviously, that's not something that, many women are open to. And if that's not even what you want, trust me, it's going to be a lot harder than you think. But when you do focus on building more muscle, that doesn't mean I think a lot of women look at women that they see like that actually look toned and fit, and like I want to look like them, and they think of like what they're doing, and like it's not cardio. I can tell you right now, a lot of women that have the body are probably looking to try to get. It's not cardio, right? And I think that the more we can embrace wanting to actually have a strong, fit body, like, why would you want to be the frailest, smallest version of yourself? Like, when do you want to be strong? When do you want to be like independent? When do you want to be like, that like kind of beast mode woman? Like, that is what's going to really actually change the game for you. And I think a lot of women I do see who have an easier time going through menopause, they understand that and they prioritize more strength training over just excessive amounts of cardio. Okay. Obviously, we have the poor sleep component, which can independently drive, hormonal dysregulation. Two main studies I actually want to pull up that I think were absolutely phenomenal. The Leprolt and Van Cotter, JAMA 2011, and Buxton et al. From 2010, noticed that just 1 week of sleeping for 5 hours a night led to reduced testosterone by 10 to 15%. We saw an increase in cortisol by 51% and reduced insulin sensitivity by 20%. And this was in men. Imagine what's happening in women. Okay. I feel like men, obviously, all you ladies know, men can typically lose fat easier in certain instances. I always like to joke around and say our bodies are built for war. Like female bodies are not necessarily built for war, right? Like men always used to go to war. I feel like, our bodies are a little bit more resilient to stress. We also don't have a menstrual cycle and, a massive system of fertility. That's totally different ballgame. That's also extremely vulnerable to stress, so keep in mind that a study like that being done in men showing those reductions and also increases in cortisol and whatnot, we can only imagine what's actually happening in women. So need to be mindful of that. Your sleep plays a really, really big role, and supporting sleep can make a massive difference. And I see that happen all the time in practice. Obviously, we have high stress and poor recovery. That HPA axis dysfunction is, since it's already dysregulated, chronic stress can compound it. So stress management is going to be key. And one of the biggest ones, ladies, alcohol. 1 in 3 women increase alcohol intake during menopause. 1 in 8 go above daily recommendations and limits. That's going to worsen every symptom driving your stress, driving hormonal imbalance, driving dysregulation. You're literally poisoning yourself. Listen, I'm all for the occasional little drink every so often, right? Glass of wine here and there. I'm a bourbon guy. I like to have a glass here and there, but I understand the depression side of things. I understand why, a lot of women lean into that, but just understand that that is going to worsen quite literally everything. There is zero benefits. There is no stress relief out of that. There is nothing. There is no research that supports at all that is going to be positive in any way, shape, or form. You might think it is, but I can promise you from a physiological perspective, it is doing nothing but harm. The sooner you cut out the alcohol, the better. Now, as always, I'm going to always give you guys some action steps, okay? Because I'm going to kind of start closing out here. I think this hopefully gave you a pretty good picture of everything. And like I said, in the next episode, I'm going to go over things a little bit more deeper in terms of the steps that we actually take with clients through perimenopause via the lens of our root method, discussing things like nutrition practices, lifestyle practices, and also some key supplementation that we do find very helpful built in for this phase. But some steps you can start to take right now is obviously number 1, stop assuming it's age. Okay, start asking why and looking deeper. Ask better questions, get better labs, start to look at your choices, start to look at your training, start to look at your diet. Are we under eating? Are we overtraining? Start to get really clear on what your actual steps that you're taking look like, because those steps could either be making or breaking you. Okay. More cardio and less food. One of those things, okay? It's pouring gasoline onto the fire, worsening your symptoms, okay? If, you have been chronically dieting for a long time, we have to support better recovery, better metabolic rate. We have to support feeding your body, fueling your body, not consistently trying to, restrict your body. Okay, that's not going to lead to a better outcome. What I always like to point out is that, like, cool, what have you been doing and it hasn't been working? All right, well, clearly it's not working for a reason. We need to find a better way. Okay, and this phase needs a different approach. I want you to be really, really clear about that. Like I said at the beginning of this podcast, the phase needs a different approach, because what worked before is not going to work now. We're on different playing field. Football, rugby, totally different playing ground. Okay, like, we have different rules here now. All right, it's a different game. Okay, similar processes. That's why I say football to rugby, because, like, they're kind of similar in practice, but, like, different overall rules. Right? We have different things at play here. Okay, we have to understand how to play the new game. Okay, so we need support, not suppression, not restriction. We need fuel. We need better recovery. All of those things do matter. Okay, so if this episode did help you understand perimenopause and menopause in a more practical way, please subscribe on your favorite platform so you never miss an episode. And please share this episode on your social media platforms to help more women understand their bodies better. It's always helpful if you leave a quick rating and a short review with your biggest takeaway. It helps more women find the show. Feel free to reach out to me on Instagram and tell me what topic you want me to break down next. Resources and next steps are in the description below. You are built for better. I will see you in the next one.